Hey everyone, today there's a lot that I want to talk to you about regarding Campi Flegrei because there are some concerning news, some strange news, some upsetting news, some weird news. There's a statement that has been given by the director of the INGV, and there's been a lot of angry comments of residents that don't believe the recent earthquake was only a 4.0. I've reported in my last video, but now there's more and more people speaking out. They said, we have been through 4.4, 4.6. This was stronger than 4.0. The boom was so loud. So you'll hear about this, but you will also hear from another prominent INGV scientist, and that I found was a little bit shocking, that he says important information measurements that are crucial for the current crisis are being held back, and not only for days, could be months, even longer. So we'll talk about that, but also the current earthquake swarm that involve the 4.0. This is always kind of strange because I get the notification from the INGV, the earthquake swarm is over. And then I look at the list and I'm like, I see all these earthquakes. So what's their reason? What's their point to declare it's over? If there's like 5 hours time frame between a few earthquakes? Because this is what they just did a few hours ago, and then they said, oh, a new earthquake swarm began. But basically what we're seeing here at Campi Flegrei, it's a constant rumbling. So this is also, some people are upset about this. They're saying, well, do you want us to feel safe by saying it's over? And then, if they don't stop, well, kind of, you have to say it started again. Because really, that's the current earthquake list, and you see the 4.0. And please tell me if you look up from the 4.0, right? Just shortly after 1.5, 1.5, 1.5, 1.3, and on the 18th, these are only the ones above magnitude 1. So there's way more microseismic earthquakes that continue after those. But if we only look at the big ones, at 8 p.m., 1.3. And then on the next day, 8 minutes after midnight. So if there's a 4-hour gap, you declare that ended and then all the next ones started, or how does that work? Because definitely now there's another one. So if the USGS would basically declare that for them, for their standards, this would be a continuous earthquake swarm. Of course, many people are saying, yeah, that's just a technical description. Not really, because psychologically it sounds better when you're saying earthquake swarm ended. Yeah, we have a new one, but that ended now. Instead of saying, especially if you look at tourism, I don't want to say anything. It's just a guess. Tourism, property values, development, if you say this has a continuous earthquake swarm, that doesn't sound so good, right? That might be one of the reasons. There might be nothing to it. This might be just their system. If X amount of hours, you declare it closed. But certainly if we look at that, for me, this is continuous. Giuseppe De Natale, he works for the INGV, very seasoned scientist, has been warning for years about the dangers of Campi Flegrei. He's also angry about his own institution and the officials always saying, oh, this unrest, this Bradyism, this is normal, blah, 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 when it is not normal. And he has made a new statement explaining again what happened before the last known eruption. And that some data are wrong, that give us a false sense of security regarding the amount of uplift that is necessary to get an eruption. Let's start what he says. He's talking about publications. You're doing a study, you're doing research, then you're studying a paper. You might release a preliminary version. He talks about that once it's released preliminary, other scientists might catch up on this, also report about this, and then kind of declare it as their work. And he says, well, he's okay with this because he says we're publicly funded and this should be available to everyone, even if it's, first presented at conferences in a preliminary form and then others catch up on it. He says, I don't worry too much about it because in my view, scientific research, in the case of where he works for, is public research. It's meant to generate ideas for others as well as encourage open competition. And this is great that he says that, because this is crucial for a dangerous supervolcano like Campi Flegrei. But what he tells then is kind of worrying. Of course, he says he believes that researchers in the public sector are paid to provide ideas without copyright, even if necessary to be plagiarized. But he says that some researchers want to protect themselves from that possibility that someone learns of their new data and might publish these data before the person who actually collected it, that was also using public funds. And he says, so ownership of these data is always debatable. So he says, to protect that, some researchers go as far as to protect their new data. What they do is deliberately they avoid sharing any news of it, even if it's alarming data. And he says, guys, for years and years. And this has happened at Campi Flegrei. This is what he says. I really like this guy because he speaks out in the open. So they're hiding it for years until it's finally published. It seems the publishing process, going through the entities, takes a lot of time. And he says a recent, and here it gets a bit scary, guys. A recent example is the sharp increase in gas emissions at Campi Flegrei. When I read that, I was like, wait a minute. So they knew months or years ahead that there was this sharp increase. And for the ones who follow me, guys, or if you know about volcanoes, any increase, and especially if it's sharp, together with other factors, can indicate a development of a volcano. Increased gas emissions, increased earthquakes, increased land rise. This is when other volcanoes pop. So did nobody know about this? This is kind of crazy. So he says, this is quote, the sharp increase in key gas emissions at Campi Flegrei was only made public immediately after the scientific paper was released, many years later. Guys, many years later. If you follow my channel or if you follow what's going on at Campi Flegrei, you can't release that many years later. You might not have many years to decide whether you need to evacuate the population in the red zone or even in extended zones with an activity like that. This is crazy. And he also says keeping data locked away for long periods, preventing the analysis by a broader scientific community, is unfortunately very common in our field. But he says it's important to make it available. He says science is based on reproducibility and therefore depends on full sharing of data and results. And he says public research or publicly funded research, in my opinion, it should not be allowed that they're holding anything back. And then he says, especially when the data may be crucial for understanding critical aspects of an ongoing emergency. Let that sentence sink in, what he's telling us here. And this matches with some of the angry residents that are accusing. I'm not saying this is the case, guys. I still want to trust the INGV with the data that they release. So many residents are angry, saying, start telling us the truth. Don't whitewash this. And Di Natale is also one of these people who says, it's don't whitewash this. And he compares this with when the virus happened. He said, this era since 2020 taught us that information, data, and results should be shared as quickly as possible, always using the preprint dissemination so that they could react, right? Being faster. And he says the problem is, if he has a new paper right now with new research, although it was formally accepted by the entities, he says, for example, over 2 weeks ago, it will likely, if that was now, right, it will likely only be published after the summer because its production process is evidently slow. But he says, of course, it's a risk if the preprint has been public for about a year that someone might have taken the idea and might manage to publish before us, he says. But he says that's fine. It wouldn't be a disaster for humanity, but maybe could save many people. This is kind of scary. I think they should definitely do something about it with such a crisis here at Campi Flegrei. And then, before we get to the unrest and the land rise that is surprisingly moving to other places of the caldera, which might indicate a potentially concerning development, let's speak about Giuseppe Di Natale again, because he said in his latest work that will be published shortly, he says this finally corrects many errors in the dating of Brady seismic episodes in generally, and more specifically in the timing of ground uplift events. And guys, really stay with me, follow closely what I'm about to say now, because the official version was always Brady seism, that's the land rise, the earthquakes, the increased emissions. Sometimes it's a subsidence. We haven't had a subsidence since 2005, by the way. Brady seism is normal. So they're telling people that it's rumbling, don't worry, that the port of Pozzuoli is running dry because the land's rising so much. Nothing to see here. This is normal with the volcano. And Di Natale has always said it's only happening before an eruption and after an eruption. Since we're not after an eruption, we're before an eruption. But he's been ignored by this. But what he's saying now, he's giving us specific dates and new numbers, because everyone before said, the land was rising so much more before the Monte Nuovo eruption in 1538. So nothing to worry yet. Well, guys, listen, the data is corrected. So he says he will finally correct many errors in dating Brady seismic episodes in generally, and specifically in the timing of ground uplift events. I have repeated that sentence. Keep that in mind when you hear what I'm saying. So he says, first, we demonstrate that already in the Greek area, 8th century BC, there's evidence of ground subsidence, particularly along the Via Herculea. That's in the Pozzuoli area, which connected Pozzuoli to Baia and enclosed the ancient lake Lucrino, which was way larger at that time than it is today. And he says this road is now submerged about 5 meters below sea level, 5 large steps. And then he speaks about the land rise in the area. He says we show that the uplift in the area, which culminated in the 1538 eruption that created the Monte Nuovo, a crater. He said it actually began after 1430 AD. So what he is saying basically, because Mauro Di Vito, he's leading the INGV, He has published a study in 2016 suggesting that the land rise began in 1251 AD. Why is this important? I don't want to go into too deep in here. I don't want to confuse anybody. I want to tell you the key point. And listen, guys. So De Natale says, it is not possible, as the study from De Vito and others in 2016 proposed, that the area where Monte Nuovo would later form by an eruption rose 19 meters shortly before the 1538 eruption. Why is this important? Because everyone says, we're not close to 19 meters. We're barely half of it with the land rise. So we don't need to worry right now. Listen to this. He says it's not 19 meters. He says, in fact, the Via Herculea located precisely there and at the time was no more than 7 meters below sea level, never re-emerged. Meaning, any local uplift must have been less than 7 meters. Do you understand what he's saying? If the land rise before the eruption was 19 meters, why is that road still submerged? You understand what I'm saying? So it must have been way less. And that is concerning because that puts us with what we have now in land rise, in the same close proximity to how far it had risen before it created the Monte Nuovo eruption that started with a phreatic explosion without fresh magma. But that was paving the way, building the tunnel like a miner for magma to come to the surface and create the next eruption, which created the Monte Nuovo crater. Everyone's saying now, yeah, we could see a phreatic eruption any day. But that could pave the way. So he says, before the Monte Nuovo eruption, the uplift must have been less than 7 meters. So he says, the study that they're working on or that they have finished demonstrates that the uplift that was preceding the last eruption, the only one that we have data from or that we can evaluate in historical time in 1538, it began also around 100 years earlier. And he says, moreover, there is no evidence of other uplift episodes since at least the 8th century BC. Here he's saying, this is not normal for Campi Flegrei. It's only uplifting when it wants to do something. He says it means that in the last 3,000 years, meaning since the eruptions that were preceding that one of 1538, the only periods of significant ground uplift and thus seismic activity and eruption risk have been the following. And now listen, guys, the approximately 100 years between 1430 and 1538 and the 75 years from 1950, when the first unrest began, to today. And the seismicity only started in 1970. So it took 100 years for the last one. We're 75 years now, guys. And it's a different area of the caldera. So you can't say, oh yeah, and we still have like something 25 years left. Nah, it's not working like this. So he finalizes his post. He says, let's hope that people finally stop claiming that the bradyseism, meaning the uplift, and the seismicity have always existed at Campi Flegrei. He's been saying that for a month. I've been reporting about that. He says, as if they're trying, and he says that, as if they're trying to portray these phenomena as normal. When in fact, and this is all quote, they are not. just 175 years of uplift, over 3,000 years of history, and over 150 years of seismicity, which is very fragmented and limited to specific periods over the time span. So what he's saying, only out of the 3,000 years, only 175 years were uplifting, where we had a bradyseism. So it's not normal. It's absolutely not normal. And crazy is that this preprint of this study he says it's been publicly available for almost a year. And he says, in my next post, I will share the final accepted version, which will be published within a couple of months. So the insiders have known about this, but publicly it was still all good, nothing to see here, bradyseism's normal, from the INGV as well. That's the institute he works for. So the earthquake swarm, in my opinion, that came with the magnitude 4 is continuing into today. We have further earthquakes. We have a peripheral area of the uplift zone that is particularly affected by these earthquakes. So we have this land rise, but in one area, you see all of a sudden most of the epicenters of these earthquakes. The epicenters are located in the area where we have seen the magnitude 4 earthquake, but also in the northwestern zone of the uplift zone at Monte Nuovo. The strongest earthquake of the current swarm there had a magnitude of 1.9. What's going on? All these earthquakes, whether this is a new swarm or an old swarm or the continuous swarm, what is important is, and many people are saying this, why are these swarms there and what implications will they have for the residents that live on the supervolcano? Densely populated. Look at this picture here. You can't even see the craters anymore because everything is paved and built on. So we have an increase in earthquakes on the edges, in the peripheral zone of this uplift area, of this uplift phase. And many call this alarming because they say that this would indicate increased stress buildup along the faults there. That could be because the uplift zone is expanding further, or because the ground in the main uplift zone is reaching its elastic limit. Imagine you're blowing up a balloon. Or this rubber band, it stretches, it stretches, it stretches. And then if you reach a point of maximum elasticity where you can't stretch it anymore. But then if you start using more force, it will break at some point. That's when we see eruptions. But it could be that the stress is being transferred because underneath we've got stuff coming up. So now this caprock layer that is keeping the lid on, since it can't rise any further in certain areas, it diverts the stress to the edges maybe. And that's why we see the earthquakes there. Main uplift zone could have lost elasticity, reached the elastic limit. And we know if it's not elastic anymore, we've talked about this in depth with all these eruptions in Iceland. Cracks are developing and the earthquakes are becoming increasingly strong. That's what we're seeing here at Campi Flegrei, and what has been confirmed by numerous studies. Just in my last video at the Geological Conference, International Conference in Geneva, this was discussed about Campi Flegrei, that caprock layer is brittle, is breaking so much. And this is especially crucial, and another study found a very weak area with a lot of cracks. That would allow magmatic fluids to, and ultimately the magma itself, to rise to the surface, because it's creeping into these fissures. And we know what that leads to. This is concerning. yeah, we hear from many official sites reassuring the public there is no immediate risk of a volcanic eruption, but define immediate. As of today, this could change tomorrow, right? But the residents are frightened. The fears of such an event are slowly but surely growing amongst the population, and it reflects in their posts what they're commenting when the INGV gives a public statement. And then, they were running on the street again when the 4.0 happened. That was a little, thankfully, not in the middle of the night. It was light out already, 9:15 or 9:17 a.m. But they have tried to train the population, assembly areas where they should go, where they could help. This was the old NATO grounds that are in the area. But then people wanted to go there to go to safety, but then it was closed. And we have seen that when we had the big earthquakes a few weeks ago, I think it was the 4.6. Mauro Di Vito, that the boss of the INGV himself, wanted to get into his institute because there was a seismic emergency. And he couldn't because the Via Tangenziale was closed due to construction. And he had problems to get to his office. Via Tangenziale is the main evacuation route, guys. So this is crazy, right? So kind of here, NATO grounds were closed. There was an event there. And it's all over social media. The residents were like, how basically could we escape in an emergency if the escape routes are blocked, if the assembly areas are closed? I mean, really, I'm laughing about this now because it's so crazy, but it's actually nothing to laugh about. They said, how can we flee in the event of an earthquake? Going outside would not be enough. Exactly, because this earthquake could be followed by something worse. So guys, this is the latest. I hope you found that interesting. If you want to know more about what was said at this geological conference in Geneva that is taking place every 4 years about Campi Flegrei, I think you'll realize, the public, how do I say that? Statements about the volcano should change. Because how can politicians and institutions justify to say, no, nothing to worry, it's closely monitored? If you hear all these studies, if you hear international scientists giving you worrisome statements. If you want to support the channel, guys, check the links in the description. You can buy me a coffee. We can chat with each other on that site. And thanks for becoming member of this channel, a supporting member. Hi to all new members. A new video is out very, very soon. And thank you for the supers. Thank you for watching and your wonderful, wonderful comments. So shout out to everyone. Maybe I see you in a second in the next one if you click the end screen. Bye-bye.